Welcome to the 2013 annual Stormwater Training. This is part one, focusing on county requirements. My name is David Kirby, professional engineer, certified professional in erosion and sediment control, as well as a qualified SWIP practitioner and qualified SWIP developer. Training overview today. For this section, we're going to talk about the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, the MS4 permit, and how that relates to county inspections and what we need to do as the county for different construction sites. The MS4 permit establishes requirements for construction projects specific to different sizes of projects. Various different BMPs are proposed for projects that are less than 1 acre. Others are stipulated for acres of 1 acre or greater. And enhanced BMPs are required for what are defined as high-risk projects. And we'll be getting into all that stuff, as well as discussing reporting of illicit discharges and connections, and at the end of the presentation we'll discuss construction site inspection requirements and documentation. How is the county involved? When projects come into planning and such, they have conditions that are imposed on development, construction, demolition projects, and these are included in construction contracts to ensure the compliance with the MS4, general construction permit, and other permits are completed. The developer and contractor, through the engineer, prepares for projects that are less than 1 acre, and their private projects would be an SW1 form. The SWPCP form is used for county projects less than 1 acre, and a stormwater pollution prevention plan and SW2 form are required for 1 acre or greater projects. And a special form, the SWHR, is required for high-risk sites. And we'll be touching on each of these and how these apply to construction sites. Defining construction activity under the MS4 permit. Construction activities are defined as clearing, grading, grubbing, excavation, basically any activity that results in land disturbance where soil is being exposed. Construction activity exemptions. For emergency constructions, activities required to immediately protect the public health and safety, as well as routine maintenance that are meant to maintain original line and grade, hydraulic capacity, or original purpose of the facility. Although a stormwater pollution control plan is not needed for maintenance projects, it is still anticipated that BMPs will be required, such as inlet protection, things like that, just to make sure that polluted stormwater is not entering the storm drain system. BMPs for projects less than 1 acre. We're just going to touch on this specific area first. There are 13 BMPs that are proposed through the MS4 permit for projects that are less than 1 acre of soil disturbance. Here's a list of them. Each of them has their own specific title and abbreviated short form, such as EC-1, which stands for erosion control, SE stands for sediment control, TC is tracking control, and so on. And these naming schemes are all from the Casca BMP handbook, and I'll be showing you where you can obtain this information later if you want to look at specifics for each of these. Here's a general picture of a construction site utilizing all of these 13 BMPs for a construction site less than 1 acre. On the far right in the middle you'll see TC1, which is a stabilized construction entrance, which is mandatory for all sites, and throughout the area you'll see sandbag barriers, sanitation and septic waste management for porta potties, concrete waste management for concrete washout for washing out trucks. This is just a nice layout showing how each one can be identified on site and be used for any construction project. County projects less than 1 acre require a SWPCP, or Stormwater Pollution Control Plan. Remember, for private projects less than 1 acre, you require the SW1 form, and for projects less than 1 acre that are public projects, and you require this SWPCP form. And the MS4 permit requires an SPCP for public agency projects, including CIPs. So their appropriate site-specific BMPs and maintenance schedules are identified, at which point within this document you have to show rationale for selecting and rejecting BMPs, so why you are or aren't using them, and there has to be a certification by a county representative for this document. And high-risk projects include enhanced BMPs in the SWPCP. So for instance, if you have a high-risk project, or it's considered a high-risk project that's the project overall is less than 1 acre and it's a public project, it would require both an SWPCP and an SWHR form. And we'll touch on each of those again in a bit. Here's an example of the SWPCP form. Here's just the front sheet of it. Basically shows your project information, contractor activities, and special conditions that are going to be expected on site, inspection and training, maintenance requirements, and on the second page there's a list of all the different types of BMPs that you have to justify if they're going to be used on site or if not, and then of course the certification requirement. For the private projects less than 1 acre, I mentioned uses an SW1 form, and this SW1 form is a checklist essentially just identifying the minimum BMPs that need to be checked, again those 13 that we initially discussed, and it shows which ones will be used, which ones won't be used, and these documents are certified by the contractor and owner. Here's a glimpse of what the SW1 form looks like. Again, this is for only projects less than 1 acre that are private projects, and this can be found at the One Stop Permitting website, and that link will be shown later on in the presentation. For BMPs and projects that are 1 acre or greater, the MS4 permit requires additional BMPs for larger construction sites. This is to implement effective combination of erosion and sediment control BMPs to prevent erosion and sediment loss. And the state regulation requires any owner of a project disturbing greater than 1 acre file for coverage under the Construction General Permit as well, which is a standard SWPPP, and that must be developed by a qualified SWIP developer and implemented throughout construction by a QSP. So for the permit portion of this, you'll see that if a project is over 1 acre, it's mandatory that the project files for coverage under the Construction General Permit, as well as provides an SW2 form to the county as what's called the local SWIP for permit compliance for the county. So for projects greater than 1 acre but less than 5 acres, there are 15 additional BMPs on top of what were identified in the SW1 form. These are items such as hydraulic mulch, geotextiles and mats, fiber rolls, street sweeping and vacuuming. Again, not all of these will be seen on any given site, but the option is there, and the rationale for using them and not using them must be presented within these forms. Here's the final list of the remaining ones that were added for the projects over 1 acre and less than 5. You'll notice on the far right there's the CASCA naming scheme as well as the Caltrans naming scheme. These do differ in some areas, and near the end of the slides we'll show locations where you can view both of these. Myself, I'm the most familiar with the CASCA naming scheme and their BMP handbook, and it's an easy, quick reference with a lot of great information in it. For larger sites, such as projects that are greater than 5 acres, they add an additional 3 BMPs that can be used, and these are just 3 of them here. Here is what the SW2 form looks like, very similar to the SW1, but it just lists the additional BMPs and the expanded rationale requirements for using or not using those BMPs. Now talking about the enhanced BMPs for high-risk projects. The high-risk projects must implement these BMPs to preclude impacts to water quality posed by construction. And for these high-risk sites, 20 additional BMPs are required to review for use on these sites, so that in total is 33 different BMPs in which rationale must be provided for why you will or will not use them on site. A high-risk project is defined as a site location that has conditions such as projects on slopes of any kind of grading on slopes of 20% or more, or the project is located within an MS4 environmentally sensitive area, which is either discharges directly to a water impaired by sediment siltation, or is directly adjacent to, which is equivalent to less than 200 feet to an environmentally sensitive area. So for those types of high-risk projects, there's these additional 33 BMPs that must be reviewed, and a lot of them, again, you won't see all 33 implemented on one site, but a lot of these are used in conjunction with each other, such as hydroseeding, fiber rolls, as well as check dams, things like that. You'll see a lot of them used together and in place of one another, such as fiber rolls or gravel bag berms. Here's a more expanded look at the construction site with all of the enhanced risk BMPs, and there's an example of all 33 on here showing where they could be used on the site. Obviously this is an ideal situation. Usually construction sites are a lot more cramped and it's a lot more difficult to identify where these areas should be, but once they've scheduled them as being implemented on site within these documents, it's mandatory that they actually use them on site. Additional high-risk project requirements. Only for high-risk projects are you required to do inspections throughout the wet season. So you'll see here that the inspections must be completed by a QSD, QSP, or CPESC at the time the BMPs are installed, and then weekly during the wet season, and again every 24 hours during any rain event. This is to verify that a lot of sediment and water is not leaving the site, and the BMPs are being used and maintenance properly throughout the duration of construction. This is what the SWHR form looks like, and you'll see on the front page there it defines the high-risk sites, and so it's easy to identify if your project will fall into this category. The additions to this are obviously the 33 BMPs rather than 13 for SW1, and they also have an attachment 1 for inspection checklist and construction activity high-risk sites, so that you actually have documentation for the forms you're supposed to be filling out when you're on site inspecting these projects. Here's the next page for the SWHR. Again, it goes through the qualification requirements of the inspector, whether it's a qualified SWIP developer, practitioner, or a CPESC doing them, identifying when this inspection was done, if it's done at the time the BMPs were installed, during the wet season, and so on. And then it has all the compliance accomplishments listed, whether it needs to be maintenance, when it was inspected, and then of course additional comments and the inspector's name and signature required. Illicit discharges and illegal connections are something the county deals quite a bit with. The MS4 permit regulates them, and we find that construction projects obviously have a high risk of illicit discharges such as oils, sediment leaving the site, various different pollutants that are used during construction, even cement dust, things like that is all considered hazardous to the environment, and we can't be allowing them to be leaving the site. What is an illicit discharge? An illicit discharge is a storm drain system, is a discharge to a storm drain system that is prohibited under local, state, or federal statutes, ordinances, codes, or regulations. So in a nutshell, it's all non-stormwater discharges not composed entirely of stormwater except discharges pursuant to an NPDES permit. And we will elaborate a bit on that so it's not so confusing. The Ventura MS4 permit identifies allowed discharges, so things like air conditioning condensate, excess irrigation water, things like that can be discharged if it doesn't come into contact with other pollutants. But essentially a pollutant is sediment, so if it touches the ground, you really have to make sure that it doesn't leave the site. That's basically a rule of thumb, is if it touches your site, you own it and it cannot be released. Here is a table out of the MS4 permit that identifies the types of discharges that are allowed and under what conditions they're allowed. For instance, uncontaminated groundwater infiltration, groundwater dewatering only with a separate NPDES permit. So anytime you're doing dewatering on a construction site, it does require additional permitting through the state. Air conditioning condensate, again, you could segregate the flow to prevent introduction of pollutants. Therefore, if it touches the ground, it's already hit a pollutant, and which is sediment or oil and grease, what have you, and it cannot leave the site. Here's a list of some other ones. Incidental discharges from potable water sources, such as fire hydrants, sidewalk rinsing if they're pressure washing sidewalks. That stuff is not allowed to leave the site unless it's meeting these specific conditions outlined in the permit. Sources of illicit discharges, such as spills, overflowing trash containers, leaks from storage tanks or transfer areas, water from hosing down worksite, or improper disposal and dumping. Here's an example of the report that needs to be filled out for reporting illicit discharges. It identifies the date and discovery of the report, location, description, what the estimated source was, type of material, probable cause, and what was done to enforce the action. So if it was cleaned up, who was informed, what educational materials were provided, and the cleanup confirmation obviously is a large aspect of this report. Required response to illicit discharges is to respond with actions to abate, contain, and or clean up within 1 business day. refer any hazardous waste or sewage illicit discharges to the Ventura County Environmental Health Department. And we have later on in the slides here a list of all the different departments that can be referred to. For instance, if you see an illicit discharge in the city of Camarillo, there's the Camarillo hotline number that you would call. If it's unincorporated county area, then you would call the county. And for any hazardous waste, then you'd obviously call the Ventura County Environmental Health Department here. And here's the list of all the different phone numbers. So there's the Ventura County Watershed Protection District hotline for county unincorporated areas. City of Camarillo, Moore Park, again, if it's falling within those jurisdictional limits, then you would call the appropriate number. County inspection requirements. The inspection requirements for the County of Ventura is to view all construction sites in the county unincorporated area to ensure proposed BMPs are being implemented, functional, and adequately maintained, to ensure that required documents are on site and updated as required. So if you do a construction inspection, you need to make sure that if the project's over an acre in size, that it has an SWPPP on site, as well as an SW2 for the county's local SWIP requirement. Any inspection logs, if there was rain, they need to have all those logs and everything on site available to any inspector. And the inspection frequency is to visit each construction site at minimum once during the wet season. And if BMPs are not being adequately implemented or maintained, they need to conduct a follow-up inspection within 2 weeks of the initial inspection. And if non-compliance continues, additional follow-up inspection within 3 months of the initial inspection is required. After that, referral to the regional board is the means of reporting it further, and that requires 2 inspections within 3 months and 2 written notices identifying those delinquencies. The stormwater inspection form, that's typical form that's used for all stormwater inspections of construction sites, lists a lot of information up front with just checkboxes showing you what documents are on site, so you can identify, yes, the SWIP is on site, or if it's less than an acre and it's a private project, then your SW1 form is on site. So it allows every single inspector of any type of project to use the same form. The second portion of that form is the inspection criteria, discussing different areas such as tracking control. Is there mud in front of the project site? Leave onto the roads in the right-of-way. Need to make sure that that gets cleaned up at the end of every day. Vehicle and equipment maintenance, are they properly handling paint and concrete and saw cutting waste on site? Are there any illicit discharges that have happened or been reported? Are there any that you see that haven't been reported? So it goes through all these different options you need to check when you're on a construction site. And the last portion of that is obviously just the signature. You need to sign it and send it to the appropriate people and file it for your records. Summary of the key concepts for this, for the county requirements, is the July 2010 MS4 permit establishes requirements for all construction projects, and this table outlines what documents are required for which projects. So for private projects less than 1 acre, you require the SW1 form. If they're less than 1 acre in a county project, then it would be a stormwater pollution control plan. And if a project is greater than 1 acre, whether it's private or public, then you have the local SWIP requirement, which means you have to file for the state requirement, which is the SWPPP, and then also submit the SW2, which is the county requirement for the same project. For high-risk sites less than 1 acre, the SWHR form is required for private projects. If it's a county project, they would require to submit both the SWPCP as well as the SWHR form. And for high-risk sites 1 acre or greater, the local SWIP requirement occurs again, where the SWPPP form is required for the state requirements, the SW2 for the county requirements, and then additionally the SWHR would be required for county requirements due to it being a high-risk site. And then construction sites are a potential source of illicit discharges and connections. They're very easily spotted on site. If something looks wrong, it probably is, and just needs to be investigated further. For additional information, you can go to the One Stop Permitting website, surface water quality section of the stormwater program, and it lists all these different forms you require, the SW1, SW2, SWPCP, and it also identifies other rules and regulations that the MS4 permit regulates. For the BMP handbooks, again with different nomenclature, there's SW, or the Casca BMP handbook lists all the different types of BMPs that are listed on each of those SW1 forms, SW2 forms, in the form of like SE1, SE2, like we discussed before in the different tables. And then you can also reference the Caltrans handbook as well. They will show essentially the same information, just categorized a little differently.